Welcome back for another episode of the Live Each Day with Purpose podcast. I have a special guest, COTE. B is the founder and executive director of Impact, Family Violence Services, and Step Up, and has worked with abusers for over 25 years. Her work is nationally recognized. She has served as the chairperson of the Domestic Violence Advocacy Council in Charlotte, North Carolina, the Charlotte City Council appointee to Domestic Violence Advisory Board, and also the North Carolina Providers of Abuser Treatment. This is actually a continuation of the series I've been doing on domestic abuse and abuse by a narcissist. And so I'm really excited to have B here because I know that she's just going to add a lot of expertise, but also she's going to be able to share what she knows of working with abusers and helping to rehabilitate them, I guess.
Yeah, I guess that's the best term for it, even though, yeah, not all domestic violence is criminal. And so we're not rehabilitating criminals for the most part, because domestic violence is different, but it's also not a mental health problem. So we're not fixing anybody, right?
Right. But just trying to work with them so that they don't go out and abuse again.
Yeah, we're trying to change a whole belief system and a whole lifetime's worth of entitlement behaviors.
So tell me exactly what it is you do, and so that people kind of have a better understanding of what your organization does. Is it something that could help someone that they know? I'm sure that a lot of people watching this, some will probably be victims and survivors of abuse, and some may even be abusers themselves. So sure. What do you do? Where does your expertise lie?
Well, and thank you for pointing out that some people are abusers themselves. Most don't know they are, which also means that most victims don't know that they're victims. And so what I do is I only work with men because there's another program nearby where I am in Charlotte that has a program for women who are offenders. But as a side note, anytime we work with women who are offenders, we need to really screen to see if they are responding to abuse with violence rather than being predominant aggressors. And if that's the case, then they need to be referred to victim services rather than abuser services. So that was my little side note. So I only work with men, adult men, who either have been accused, have been found to have been abusive to intimate partners or past intimate partners, or who they themselves recognize that they are or may be abusive. And that's the population I work with. And we have a 26-week minimum program that is certified by the state of North Carolina here. And if anybody is looking for such a program where they are, maybe what they want to do is Google BIPs, Battering Intervention Programs. But here in North Carolina, we are Domestic Violence Intervention Programs, DVIPs. And you can Google that term to find a program near you. It's really important that programs like mine work closely with those who are providing services to the victims, because what we do is for the victims. So we are actually advocates against domestic violence. And a lot of people that confuses, but you work with the abusers. We work with the abusers to hold them accountable, to hopefully stop the abuse. And like my hashtag says, only abusers can stop abuse. So when we're working with victims, we're trying to put Band-Aids on abuse that has already occurred. When we're working with my guys, we're trying to prevent future abuse. And so in that way, it is prevention and intervention at the same time. By intervening, we're hoping to prevent future abuse. So the program is, we start with an intake. And the intake appointment, we gather a lot of information. Sometimes we get people who come to us and say, can you do an assessment? That's really important. because domestic violence doesn't have a clinical cause. It's not caused by substance abuse. It's not caused by mental illness. Therefore, there is no assessment protocol in place to assess for abuse. Abuse is a behavior.
Mhm.
Now, it can run the whole range, as you know from the past podcasts you've been doing. And, a lot of people know now that most domestic violence is not criminal. Most domestic violence is not physical.
Mhm.
And so, therefore, people may not know they're being abusive unless they are beating their partners repeatedly, or the victim unless she is being beaten. Because what I see that tends to happen with victims is, number one, these guys don't come into relationships with these women as abusers. These are people who fall in love, who put their best foot forward. Don't we all do that at the beginning of a relationship? Don't we try to look our best? Don't we try to show our best side of our personality? I mean, that's what we do. Otherwise, we wouldn't be dating, because if we showed everybody who we were right at the very beginning, why would they continue to go out with us? I tell my guys being my clients, go ahead and punch her in the face on the first date. And they're like, what? And I said, yeah, punch her in the face on the first date. That way she'll know exactly what she's dealing with, and she can decide never to go out with you again. Rather than fall in love with you, believe all the BS you put out there, and then later on you punch her in the face. And by that time, she's like, we've got 3 years of you never punching me in the face. We've got kids, we've got a house. And so in working with these abusers, I am trying to provide some safety for their past, current, or future partners. And so it is a court-ordered program for the ones who have been court-ordered, but it's also open to those who are self-referred. So what that means is they come to us for an intake. We don't do an assessment. They come to us because they recognize they have a problem, or because they've been found guilty or pled guilty to a domestic violence situation. And then we take it from there. So they're already acknowledging some kind of abuse when they come into the program. Those who don't, we're like, well, what are you going to work on for the next 8 months? Are you just going to be like picking lint out of your belly button? What are you going to be doing? Well, we get all kind of excuses. I haven't really been abusive. I've never put my hands on her. I haven't really been abusive. I just told the courts what they wanted to hear. I haven't really been abusive because I'm not that kind of guy. I haven't really been abusive because I didn't mean to hurt her. So, we get all that at the very beginning. So the assessment that we do within the intake is really for our own information, to find out how dangerous this guy's abuse is to the victims.
So you had mentioned that abuse isn't just physical. What are the other ways you can be abused within relationships without someone laying a hand on you?
Oh, wow. Good question. Oftentimes it starts with isolation of the victim. That is keeping her away from family and friends so that you weaken her support system and make her more dependent on you. And the way that may look is, baby, if you loved me, you'd want to spend more time with me instead of them. Okay. It can look like, honey, you don't need to work. I got you. Just stay home, take care of things at home, and don't worry about it. Those people are causing you too much stress. So it looks like love at the beginning, right? So it could be really creep up on people. And so we got isolation. We've got using male privilege if the man is an abuser and is abusing women. And by the way, since I only work with men, when I refer to abusers, I'm talking about men. And when I refer to victims, I'm talking about women or girls. Just simply because that's the population I work with, and overwhelmingly, statistically, that is the population that we all work with. And so, they may use male privilege, and that means just deciding what goes on in the house, and not giving the victim any kind of authority over what happens in the house, over disciplining and teaching the children, over, you know, anything. He's the boss of the house, so he can use that privilege, which he already has, in order to abuse her. Then you've got one we call obfuscation. Using obfuscation, and if you look at your power and control wheel, and by the way, if people aren't familiar with the power and control wheel, Google that, and there is a power and control wheel for every demographic known to man, right? There's one for every language, every religion, every culture, and so, you know, there is a power and control wheel for everybody. The one I use says using obfuscation in place of the original wheels, denial, minimization, denial, and blaming. And so using obfuscation is more, it brings in more of the gaslighting, and the purposefully messing with her head. So I like it better than just minimization, denial, and blaming for that reason, in that it's more inclusive of some of the more manipulative behaviors that occur. So manipulation, you know, falls under that. That's definitely one. And a lot of people have heard about gaslighting. And so then another one may be using emotional abuse. And that, you know, gaslighting can also fall under that, but that's also, you know, letting her know that she's a piece of crap, that she's a piece of garbage, making her feel that way all the time, putting her down, basically destroying her soul is what emotional abuse does. And they could do that without ever doing anything physical or anything. I mean, and you don't see billboards with a victim who's been emotionally abused.
Right.
But yet we've got a heck of a lot more than that. And victims report that that is the worst thing, because also coercive control can fall under that emotional abuse, right? And so when you've got that kind of behavior, you don't have the black eyes, you don't have those strangulation marks, you don't have any of that. You're not going to be on a billboard.
Yeah.
And so how are you going to know you're being abused if he's never beaten you, if he's never put his hands on you? So, you know, and that's my concern too for family justice centers, which are becoming really popular all over the world, really, is that family justice centers, the model focuses on criminal domestic violence behavior. And it also leaves out in their model those who work with the abusers. And in my way of thinking, anytime you have a discussion about domestic violence in the community, folks who work with the abusers need to be at the table. And that's because of, like I said, the only way to stop abuse is with the abusers. Yeah. So we can provide all these wonderful victim services that we want to, but what are we doing to stop the abuse? Yeah. It can't be with the courts, especially if it's not criminal. And even if it is through the courts, only a microscopic amount of abusers are held responsible through our courts. So that's one of my concerns with almost every community, is that they don't make room at the table for me and people like me who are working with the abusers. And by working with the abusers, have a lot of contact with victims. Another place where we are not at the table is with domestic violence fatality review teams.
Oh.
Yeah, fatality review teams are really important, especially in larger cities where you're going to have at least 4 domestic violence murders a year, because they take about 4 a year. I guess they could do less, and they review them in a confidential way with everybody at the table who might have or has had any contact with anybody involved in that case. And they review that to see if there was something that the community can do to improve their response to domestic violence. So anyway, that's a side note. So everybody who works with domestic violence victims who is grant funded also works with victims who aren't necessarily physically abused. The only place is the shelter that may not be able to shelter somebody who's not at physical risk. But everybody else, counseling, everything, they should be able to meet the needs of victims who have not been physically or criminally abused as well. So,
can you explain a little bit about what coercive control is? Because some people might not understand what that is.
yeah, that is using things like manipulation to control a victim. And I do want to say too about control. If you look at the power and control wheel, which I have one right here, hold on just a second and I will grab it for you, but I don't know if people will see it backwards here or not. So this is a power and control wheel, and this is the one I use, and you
can see it correctly.
Okay. And so if you can see, let me hold it even closer. So down at the bottom at 5 o'clock, if this were a clock, you'd see using obfuscation there. And then in the middle, what you see is power and control. And then on the outside is a ring that says physical violence and sexual violence. Oftentimes, that ring, that it could be just one act of physical violence and sexual violence that occurs that keeps their control through all these other tactics without ever having to be controlling physically again. And I use my grandmother as an example. She died of COVID at 102 this past winter, but she was abused one time by my step grandfather 50 years before. And that was all he needed to keep control of her for the next 50 years. Yeah, yeah. And as an immigrant woman, she was from France. As an immigrant, she had no access to resources unless she worked. But she was dependent on him financially to make the house payments. And he, you know, so he left the home, right? But he came over every day so she could do his laundry and cook for him. And he decided how he was going to treat her that day and if he was going to give her any money toward the household expenses. So all of that, he kept her in coercive control. He kept her in control while never, ever again putting his hands on her. He actually didn't even put his hands on her that one time. He threw a chair at her or something. And just that was enough to keep her under control. And I have other family members who have been through the same thing, but nobody ever described them as abusive. We just thought he was a jerk, you know? And so anyway, so back to the power and control wheel, then we have using coercion and threats as a separate item on the power and control wheel. And so making threats of harm or death could be criminal, right? That is something that can be a criminal behavior while also being emotionally abusive. So threatening. And for a victim, it may be a veiled threat, but it could be a threat she clearly understands, right? So that could be the look in the courthouse. Perfect example of that is if you've seen the movie Private Violence, which I would encourage everybody to see. It's a North Carolina product, and it's the life work of a friend of mine in the film named Kit Gruelle. And at some point in the movie, Kit goes to court. This is a documentary. So Kit goes to court, and the cameras are on the victim who's pleading for a restraining order. And as the defendant, the abuser, is led out of the courtroom, he shoots a look at her that would knock you off your feet. It was that threatening and that hateful. But who can do anything about a look? But she clearly got the message. She was terrified. She was shaking. She was terrified. And so that's one way of being, one way of being abusive that isn't physical and not necessarily criminal. And then we have using intimidation. Also, that look can be intimidating. Posturing can be intimidating. But again, do you see billboards where a victim has been intimidated? So you can control a victim that way too. Now back to the middle, power and control. Let me propose to you that power is a thinking, a belief system. Control is how you use your power. So power is a belief system, control is an action. Okay, so most abusers use their power that they already have, because society has given this to them in our patriarchal society. They already have. This does not mean that all men abuse their power,
right?
Or that all men are abusive. Of course not. What's funny is that we don't know how many men are abusive, because no men are willing to give up money for studies to show how many men are abusive, right? And they're controlling the purse strings, so for the most part. So anyway, if you look at it that way, and there's a bigger word that I like to superimpose on power and control, and that is entitlement. So most of my guys abuse because they felt entitled to. So they use their power to control because they felt entitled to. And that is why abusers abuse, in one sentence.
You had talked about how, like when you're using an example of your family, of how you didn't think of it as abuse. You just thought they were being a jerk.
Right.
And I think there's oftentimes too many times when we don't know if it is abuse, because it might be something just as simple as crossing a boundary. And at what point does crossing a boundary become abuse? And I remember when we had talked earlier, you had said, like, crossing a boundary once is a mistake. Crossing it, the same boundary, more than once is a pattern. And I think oftentimes, when you're in a relationship and you're trying to figure things out, you might put in boundaries, but you are kind of like, well, he crossed it. Is he a bad guy? Is he a guy I should kind of walk away from? And I think by the time you realize it's a pattern, you're far into the abuse and you're like, oh my gosh, what happened? And now you can look back and see that it was boundary after boundary that had been crossed, red flag after red flag. And of course, people will say, did you not see the red flags? Did you not put boundaries in place?
That's great. And let me address that. And that's a great point. Abuse is intentional. Okay, so crossing now, okay, for the most part, abuse is intentional. So let's stick with that for now. But crossing a boundary multiple times when your partner has said to you, this bothers me, please don't do this again, that's intentional. And so that means it's abusive.
Mhm.
Okay, because abusers abuse because they feel entitled to or have the right to. They make a decision to abuse. And I'm gonna move to how victims perceive it in a second.
Okay.
And so they make a decision to abuse. And how I know that is because if I ask my clients, if you knew for sure that you were going to jail for a year that night, no get out of jail cards, nothing. If you knew you were going to jail, would you still have abused her? And they all say no. Which means that it was something that they considered
Mhm.
before abusing her.
Mhm.
Whether they don't know it, right? And I'm
Right.
talking about a split second, one of those little wires in your head. But that is one of the reasons they made to abuse her. They first of all felt entitled to. And what that means is I have a right to because she's caused me pain or she stepped out of line. She hurt my feelings.
Mhm.
I have a right to, that's that entitlement. Or I have an obligation to, for my family name, for my reputation.
Mm.
Okay, so those are all entitlements. Now, like we said, domestic violence very rarely starts with a punch in the face on the first date, because we're not stupid, right?
Mhm.
Would we ever go out with a guy who hits? No. In fact, we're having him locked up,
Right.
right? We're not stupid.
Mhm.
We fall in love with the man he presents himself to be. Okay, so the other thing about victims is that number one, they don't see it happening.
Mm.
This has to be a glitch the first time he hurts her feeling, the first time he crosses a boundary
Yeah.
that she's put down.
Yeah.
So she's like, he didn't mean to, he's never done anything like that before.
Mhm.
Then a month, 2 months later, he holds her down. Well, again, you don't see billboards of women who are being restrained.
Right.
So she says, oh my God, he's never done anything like that before.
Mhm.
And he says, oh, baby, I am so sorry. I am so sorry. You know, I've never done anything like that to you before. I would never hurt you. I would never put my hands on you. Okay. So 2 months later, he trips her laughing
Mm.
and she falls.
Mm.
Baby, I'm so sorry. You know, I was just messing with you. I was just playing with you. I didn't mean for you to fall.
Mhm.
And she's like, this has never happened before. He's never done anything like this before. So we call that siloing, right? So by the time he physically punches her, if he ever does,
Mhm.
she goes, he's never done anything like this before.
Yeah.
And he hasn't.
Yeah.
So what she's not seeing is that pattern,
Mhm.
right? She's also not seeing the non-physical pattern. Okay.
Mm.
So when we define domestic violence, intimate partner abuse, as a pattern of controlling, coercive, or physically abusive behaviors, or sexually abusive behaviors, or threatening behaviors. But there has to be a pattern there of something, even if it's not physical.
Mhm.
What is the pattern? And so having somebody who's struggling with understanding that they're being abused, or somebody who's struggling with understanding that they're being abusive, look at the power and control wheel.
Mhm.
Another important tool that I use, I send this a lot to therapists who are struggling with somebody who's having trouble identifying as a victim, is something called a hurtful and controlling behaviors check sheet. Because if they check off a bunch of those which don't say abuse, it paints that pattern
Okay.
for them. Anyway, so you were
And I
talking.
can post both of those, and I'll post both of those with our episodes that people
Okay.
can.
Okay. And then there's only a couple of others that I didn't get to. And one is using economic abuse. And this is very, very popular with guys who have money. And especially if their partners stay at home raising the kids, the guy will use huge amounts of economic abuse. I had a case one time where when the victim finally left him, she was a master's degree teacher. When she finally left him, she had no idea how to write a check because he had controlled the finances to that degree where he wouldn't even teach her how to write a check. And so she had no idea how to pay bills, anything like that. So on the surface, okay, well, if we're traditional people, he makes the money, so he's in charge of how the money is spent, not realizing that you're completely dependent on him.
Yeah.
And so that could cause a lot of trouble too. Other things are preventing her from working and having her own money, making her accountable for every penny that's spent, asking to see receipts when she's been to the store, looking through the house at things she may have hidden from him, not letting her buy basic necessities or anything he deems a splurge. All of those are economic abuse. And again, none of it's criminal.
You were talking about, if it gets to physical, and I know with my ex, it never got to physical. But he had a lot of patterns that I then ended up seeing after I got out of the relationship, of them being abusive patterns. And boundaries was a really big deal where I would put a boundary in place and he would cross it. And we'd have to have discussions. Like one of them was, don't take pictures of me when we're on a FaceTime or a Zoom call. I'm not comfortable with that. And he would quickly take a few pictures in a row. And again, I'd express, I didn't like you doing that. He's like, oh, sorry, my mistake. Okay, I won't do it. And I said, I need you to send them to me. And he's like, I'll send them if they're good. And then we'd be on another call and he'd do it again. I said, again, I don't want you to do that. And I want to see those pictures. Well, they weren't good. And I was like, that wasn't the point. The point was I wanted to see what you were taking pictures of. It's an evasion. I felt like it was such a violation of crossing of my boundaries. And I think, a lot of times victims and survivors, once you've been abused, you are at a higher risk of being abused again. And so when people look at this victim and they're like, well, wait a second, this happened with this one, now this happened with that one, you're the common denominator, so it must be you. But I don't think people realize how much at risk we are for it happening again, because one, the guys we're entering into relationships with who do abuse are predators. They know we're vulnerable. They know what we've been through, and they know that our wall of defense is down. They know that it's been hit before, and it's not as strong as it could be. And so it makes us more likely to be abused. But I remember also be like talking to him about boundaries, and you would think that it would be an easy conversation. Like, he should have boundaries. I should have boundaries. We should be safe to discuss them. And it would cause him to have epic tantrums. I mean, going off the handle of me expressing boundaries, even going to his counselor and his counselor coming back and saying, she's controlling because I was putting boundaries in place. And I'm like, we need to have boundaries in place. And I think also with boundaries, and we discussed this in our earlier conversation, is sometimes you don't know like what's just happened. Is what they're saying a joke? Are they being serious? And you had told me the story of an ex of yours talking about poisoning his grandfather. And
I didn't believe it, so I just didn't.
Yeah, like how, like it's just such a crazy thing.
That's so absurd. That's so absurd. Why would anybody do that?
Right, right. But then, you know, if you think about it, very much could what they're saying be actual, not just a joke, but actual warning of what they are really trying to reveal to you, how they feel, how they think, and what they could later act on.
And exactly why I didn't want to believe that, because if I believed that he had done that, then I would have to then deal with the fact that he's capable of anything. And that means with me as well. And I was not ready to deal with that.
Yeah. And I think when you had shared that, it brought to mind how my ex is a graphic designer, musician, and he wrote a screenplay. And he had been married before, and he wrote the screenplay about trying to win back his ex-wife. And this is something he really did, guys. He pretended to be a different person. He wrote to her as this person, made her meet him somewhere where she thinks she's meeting this different guy. She finds out it's him. She doesn't like that. He writes this whole screenplay about winning her back and says, we're going to be getting married. I want you to write the screenplay with me. And I'm like, have you lost your mind? I'm not writing a screenplay with you about how you win back your ex-wife. I was like, who would do that? And he said, fine, I'll just tell you. I kill her off. He said, and I'm mostly in the psychiatrist's office hallucinating about seeing my dead wife. And I'm like, again, it's like the craziest thing, B, that I'm like,
who wants to believe that we've fallen in love with this crazy person?
I know. I'm like, are you being serious? And he's like, yeah, I kill her off. And the thing that I was thinking was, whoa, because he's telling me she doesn't know I'm killing her off. She, you know, I'm in the office, you know, dealing with bipolar, because he wrote the man part, the male, you know, the main male part after him. And my first thought was, why are you imagining your ex-wife dead? Like, that to me is unbelievably concerning. Two, if this is how you're imagining her and what you're thinking about her dying,
what happens the first time you get mad at me?
Right. What do I have to look forward to? And guys, it was very concerning. I mean, and that wasn't the only concerning like behavior, but this really kind of was what made me start to think, oh my gosh, who is this guy? Like, yeah. This isn't safe. I don't want to be with someone who's imagining someone that he loved being dead, like writing out their death. Who does that?
I think we have to imagine what would happen if this story was on ID channel later, you know? And if we were interviewed and somebody said, so when he wrote a script and he asked for your help and he killed off his ex in the script, did you not think at that point that you might be at risk in the future? And we're like, no.
Yeah, I mean, you know, when I told my accountability partners, they said, do you think that you could get married to him and be comfortable being alone in a house with him? And I said, no. No. There's a reason they got a divorce. And it's interesting. Everything he claimed his ex did. Everything was always every ex's fault. Everything he claimed his ex-wife did, he started doing in our own relationship, which got me thinking, what would her side of the story be?
Oh, yeah.
You know,
yeah.
Why did it really end? And what did he do to her? Like, yeah. I mean, this was very concerning. I think also boundaries come down to, you know, like you were saying, control, jealousy. Jealousy, I noticed, was a huge thing. And I keep seeing these memes be all over social media where it says, like if you know that a guy really loves you when he's jealous because he just wants to spend all the time with you. And I'm like,
Well,
that
if
is
you're 13, but even then, no, jealousy is never a mature attribute or a healthy one, ever.
right.
If you're in a relationship with somebody who is jealous, what are they going to do if you start seeing somebody else, if you break up with them?
Right.
That's not going to go well.
And interesting, when I broke up with him, we had taken a break and then got back together. And during that break, because he didn't like that I'd broken up with him, he smeared me. He made people question my sanity, my beliefs, everything. And then he came back and eventually said, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. She was telling the truth the whole time. It was me. And everybody was like, oh my gosh, you're so sweet.
Oh, you're so vulnerable. Thank you for being vulnerable with us.
Yes. And guess what? No one ever asked, how's she doing that you just smeared and annihilated her reputation, did irreparable damage. How is she doing? They all saw him as a hero.
Well, I had a client one time who was determined to be fully accountable. He was working our program. He found something on every part of the power and control wheel that he had done to his ex. And he went back to all of the family members and all of the friends that he had smeared her to, right? Because he had told them all about this horrible thing she was doing, how she had him arrested and how she was running around on him, et cetera, et cetera. So he painted her to be this horrible woman. So he goes back to all these people to try to correct that, to make amends, to explain that it had been him the whole time, not her, that she had absolutely no responsibility for any of his abuse. And do you know that they wouldn't believe him?
Huh.
He was that convincing originally when he was lying that they wouldn't believe him when he told the truth. Because how comfortable is that for you to believe you got scammed by your friend, by your son, and so he's like, no, I really did this. I'm the one who told you that she was this and that and the other. And his family and friends are like, oh no, we know how awful she was. So he couldn't even fix it.
Why do men smear their victims during and after the relationship?
To make themselves look innocent, and to give them a sense of more control.
And why is it like you kind of touched on a little bit about why people aren't willing to see it, but how is it that so many people can miss seeing this abusive side of them?
We don't live with them, and even if we did, how much of the time is he abusive versus how much of the time is he okay? Especially at the beginning, he's okay almost always.
Yeah.
Or he's loving even almost always. Or he's sweet, or he's fun, or he's generous almost always. So victims then live for the day where the man they fell in love with will come back, because they're still seeing glimpses of that. And if there are glimpses, there is hope. What they don't understand is that that man they fell in love with never existed.
I had to learn that the hard way.
Yeah, that was the person they fell in love with, right? But he was the fake person. The guy you've got now is the real one. And that is so hard because once we acknowledge that, then we have to do something. And how awful it is that we now have to do something. when we have children with him, when we don't work, when we are a stay-at-home mom, when we have a house. Well, all our friends are our couples friends from the neighborhood, where we go to church with people who know us there.
Yeah.
And so you risk losing everything.
Mhm.
But what if he's never hurt you physically? So you're risking losing everything for a man who's never hit you?
Yeah.
That's what you're going to get. Why would you risk? Just sit there and put up with it. Or maybe if you didn't talk back so much.
It always comes back to shaming and blaming the victim.
Absolutely. But the community does that too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. How damaging is the abuser's smear campaign against their victim?
Like I said earlier, it could be soul destroying. It could be, especially when it happens time and time again, he's emotionally battering her. He's tearing down every resistance, every defense that she has.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you remember this case. It was long ago. It was like in the late 80s, I want to say. The case of Lisa in New York, the little girl who was starved and beaten to death. And it turns out that her adoptive mother had been just destroyed by her husband. And so she participated in the abuse as well.
Mm-hmm.
If you can Google that, Lisa, New York, Lisa murder. I don't remember the name of the family, but that mom is one who was absolutely destroyed. He tore down everything she was.
Yeah.
She became unrecognizable, and I hate to use this term, but very, very damaged.
Mm-hmm.
And it was all on him.
Yeah.
But yet she bears some responsibility, even though it was all on him, for the fact that her daughter died and was abused.
Wow. I know that during our relationship, he was very critical. He was critical of how I looked. He told me that my legs were fat. I had shared a picture with him that I had posted online, and he said that he couldn't even look at it, that he was repulsed by my legs.
Okay, so the whole reason that they do that is to let you believe that he's the only person who loves you and to keep you with him.
Mm-hmm.
And so he'll tear you down in the hopes that you'll believe that you'll become emotionally dependent on him, because who else wants you with your fat legs, right?
Yeah.
Right. And I'm sitting here looking at you going, fat legs, what? Right. And so the more absurd they are, the more of a favor they're doing us, right? Like,
yeah.
If somebody were to say to me, I hate how skinny you are, all I could do is laugh, right? But yeah, so they do that to make themselves feel better, and sometimes to intentionally destroy her self-esteem.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the dangers of dating and meeting someone online, because that's how we had met. And, I think it's safe to say not everyone online is portraying them accurately. It's very easy. It's much easier to deceive and hide who you truly are.
Right.
When it's online.
Right. I hate to say this. I hate to act like the old fuddy-duddy in the room. You're never seeing a true person online. Okay. Yeah. So I understand that you're trying to get to know somebody, especially if they live far away, online first. You meet them online, you see them online, you fall for whatever person they're putting themselves out to be online. But eventually you have to meet up. Don't move in with them the minute you meet up, you know, or even 6 months after you meet up. Do not introduce them to your children for 6 months minimum until you've gotten a commitment that you're going to be lifelong partners. The children don't need to see you experimenting and having trial relationships, right? Because they think that's the real thing each and every time. And so it's really, really awful on children. So the other thing is that we've gotten really good about Googling criminal histories, right? But remember what I said about domestic violence and how much of it is criminal?
Yeah.
I'd say less than 10%, less than 5% is criminal. So by Googling somebody's criminal history, you are not going to find almost all abusers.
Yeah.
So one thing that you can do is look to see how many really close friendships they have, long-term friendships, right? And look to see, you're laughing.
Because he told me I was his only friend. That like, you're my only friend.
Red flag, red flag, red flag, right?
Because I don't want to be your only friend. Go find friends.
I don't want, no, I do not need for you to be dependent on me. Which is
Yeah,
like somebody told me one time that maybe I'd find somebody to date if I let men believe I couldn't live without them. I'm like, how stupid. I would have absolutely no respect for a man who said that, because I'm like, how have you managed to survive all these years without me?
Right.
Anyway, so back to the online dating.
Yes.
So I would look for close ties with real people. Okay, not a big social media presence, but really real people. Have him, you know, FaceTime you when he's at the family picnic, you know. Right, or when he's going to a church event, when he's getting together with his friends. Is he hiding you? Is he hiding his relationship with you? Is he moving too fast? So all of the things that we caution about abusers, you're going to be looking for in online relationships as well. But just don't depend on your internet searches to make decisions for you about people you're dating. Okay. Look at real relationships. Look at men who say, and women, anybody who trash talks an ex. Okay. If they're trash talking an ex, number one, you have no clue what really happened in that relationship.
Right.
Are you falling hook, line, and sinker for some BS he's given you? Is he still friends with his ex? Is she on social media with him? That can be healthy. That could also be not healthy. Has he moved past it? Are they just casual friends because they only dated casually for a minute? And now they're casual friends.
Yeah, I will say he trash talked every ex he's ever had, including his mom. He trash talked his mom, and you know, he said that he dated everybody he pretty much dated had some type of sexual trauma in their past, and then he would trash talk them by saying that their worth was less because of that. And then even said any woman who has ever been with a man outside of marriage is a slut. And I'm like, wow. And guys, like, there's nothing.
I don't think that this guy could have like coated himself in red paint and had any more red flags, you know, but you know what, we women, what we'll do is we'll look at the guy with the blinking sign on his forehead that says abuser, and we'll go, oh, did she make you think you were abusive? I know you would never be that way with me. We'll do that.
Yep. I mean,
It doesn't matter what I say, Whitley, because people aren't going to listen.
yeah,
Love.
I will say that when he kept talking to me about his past relationships, I felt bad for him. Like he's accusing this one. But then at some point I thought, wait a second, you're claiming the exact same thing happened with every single relationship. I don't think that's possible. I don't think every single one did the exact same thing.
What's the common denominator here?
Him.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, but when we're in love, like I said, I could talk till I'm blue in the face, right?
Mm-hmm.
But people aren't going to listen to me because they're going to think this guy's an exception.
Yeah. And I will say this, he didn't have anything that I could find. There was no criminal history. I will say
I knew you looked, Whitley.
Yeah.
Because we all do.
Yeah. On our very first Zoom call, which was a couple weeks after meeting and connecting, he told me he loved me. He was very quickly wanting to talk about getting married. He asked me how soon we could be intimate, when my boundary was, we're not going to be intimate unless we're...
Here's my red pen. I'm just putting red marker all over that.
I told him we weren't going to be intimate unless we were married. And so he wanted to know how soon that was going to be happening. And lo and behold, I happened to be, at the same time I was friends with him on Facebook, I was also friends with one of his ex who ended up blocking him. And it just, all these things kept coming out that he doesn't view women in the best lights. He doesn't, he'll say that he's wanting to help women who have been abused, but really he just is abusing them. There was all of these things that were coming out that I was like, who is this guy? Because he was not the guy that he initially made me believe who he was. And I think also, if you look over, so he's 53. He's much older than me. And over his 6 relationships in his 53 years, one woman he was married to for 13 years and divorced. 3 additional women he was supposed to marry, myself included. There was another woman he wanted to marry. She didn't want to marry him. Our relationship recently ended, and he just got into another relationship with a woman long distance as well. That's his relationship history. I mean, nothing pointing to, a healthy, long-term. Right. And so I think also the other thing is, you see abusers, they abuse, they quickly get out in and out of relationships. Then they get into another relationship. And I think one of the questions is, did they change? Does this new girlfriend not see who they are? Was it me? Was I just, was there something about me that just had written on it, abuse me? Like, what's the answer to that? Because I know
that's what my guys tell me sometimes, that it was just her, it was just that one, and they get into other relationships, but if they don't fix themselves, they're going to be abusive in those relationships too, because at some point she's going to do whatever it was that he blames the ex for triggering in him, right? Because we're human. And so unless he handles his problems, but I hear that all the time. But here's the thing that's really important. And my guys tell me to warn other clients about this. You will not be able to stay in the same relationship with the woman you abused. And I know that a lot of victims send me their guys hoping I can fix them so they can stay in the same relationship. I've maybe, in 16 years of running Impact, I've maybe seen 1 or 2 relationships survive.
I mean, how likely is it that an abuser abuses, gets out of that relationship? I mean, like, that relationship ends, gets into a new relationship, and he's no longer an abuser?
doesn't happen. It's just temporary. And one of the questions I ask in our intake is what's the longest amount of time you've been completely alone without any kind of intimacy, whether it's sexual intimacy or a dating relationship, even an online dating relationship. And that tells me something about them. If they haven't been like voluntarily by themselves without dating for a significant period of time as adults, they don't know how to adult. They're probably completely emotionally dependent on their victims. And so here's something else. You can be emotionally dependent, i.e. in love with your victim, and still abuse her. That becomes very confusing for victims. I know he loves me.
Yeah.
So why does he hurt me? Well, dear, that's because that's not real love. That's dependency.
Right.
And he's abusing you because of all his needs and issues, but he is dependent on you. And this is why leaving an abuser is so dangerous. Even if he's never physically been abusive, right, if he is emotionally dependent on his victim, she can't leave. Because if she leaves, it is literally in his feelings taking a part of him with her. And if she's his only friend, right, then she is also the keeper of his secrets. She's the keeper of his heart, his emotions, which all sounds sexy in historical romances and poetry, right?
Yeah.
She's the keeper of his heart, right? But she is also the keeper of his secrets. He has been vulnerable with her, which is very confusing to her. He's been vulnerable with me. I know the true him, so I know he doesn't hate me.
Yeah.
It's very complex.
Yeah.
And so when this guy's victim leaves, he's lost everything. And that's when murder happens. And up to a fourth of domestic violence murders are murder-suicides. And that's those cases.
Yeah. I will say that, something I learned about him was there was no maturity. There was no self-awareness. He would post things on Facebook saying, I love this picture of you. You really get around. And I'm like, you can't say that. And he's like, why? What's the big deal? And I'm like, do you not know what that means for you to say that about someone? So there was those concerns, but we had a long distance relationship and he was going to be coming into town. And I remember it was around Valentine's Day. I'd sent him a gift and an envelope. And he told me he was taking the envelope and like putting it all over his face, rubbing it all over him because he wanted to feel my touch. I touched it. He wanted to feel me. And I'm like, what? Like, why are you doing that? And he's like, oh, you're not okay with that. And then he said that he was going to sleep with the envelope on the pillow next to him. And I'm like, I am not comfortable with that. Again, epic tantrum. I'm done. I can't believe you're not okay. Then I'm like, that's creepy. And he didn't get it. But guys, when I was talking to my accountability partners, the thought of being alone with him, even in public, creeped me out so much because I think it's really easy to disguise who you are, like you said, online. So when we be on the phone, I could pick up on things that were concerning and kind of made my skin crawl. But when we go on a Zoom like this, and he's staring at me for 7 hours straight as we're having this, oh yeah, really close, all like that, and not hardly saying a word, it freaked me out. And I was like, can you please say something? He's like, I just can't stop staring at you. I
Oh
love
my
the way your
God, he's
hair is,
obsessed.
and the profile and the way your hairline is and your nose and this. And I'm
You're
like,
perfect, Whitley.
yeah, I know, I'm so perfect. And guys, I couldn't even look at him because it made me, I felt like I was under this
So
microscope.
can you tell me then at what point you said enough? When did you realize that the creep overwhelmed everything positive you were seeing?
Well, we had broken up, taken a break, and got back together. I mean, it was a brief break, got back together within a week. And then it was probably 2 weeks later when I learned about the smear campaign and realizing that that's when I found out about him envisioning his ex-wife dead. And as I was really having time to think through everything, I thought, oh my gosh, this guy's crazy. There's something very wrong. And when he started telling me about like, well, when we get married, I'm going to watch you get ready. I'm going to watch you do your hair. I'm going to watch you do this. I was like, and then there's no boundaries. Like, he wanted me to be his only friend. He said he's going to have to go everywhere with me. I'll go grocery shopping. You don't have to shop away. No, I like my space. I like my time alone. I'll go with you when you go shopping for clothes. I'll pick your clothes out. And I'm like, nope, I can pick my own clothes out.
Let me ask you, is this the person you refer to as a narcissist when you talk about doing your work with a narcissistic abuser?
Yes.
Because he sounds to me like he's got a lot more problems than narcissism. I don't even know that he's narcissist.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, I think that there's a lot of narcissistic traits that I could see like, oh yeah, that's something he did. That was like, oh yeah, there's love bombing, there's gaslighting, there's this, there's that. But I think if you guys have watched the other episodes, you know that narcissism's kind of become this pop psychology term when really it is domestic abuse and domestic violence.
Right.
And
I hate to even use the term narcissist.
yeah, because it minimizes it.
Well,
And
it minimizes it. Also, it misdirects the help that victims need. Victims have a need for safety, and labeling their abuser as being a narcissist does absolutely nothing for getting them safe. And so I've got a big problem as a clinician. I've got a big problem with this overdiagnosis of people that you don't even know, that you haven't seen or assessed as having a narcissistic personality disorder. Most of my guys, and like I said, I've done this for a very long time, most of my guys are not narcissists. They're almost all jerks. They're almost all self-centered. But most of them are not narcissists. You're going to find more narcissists in a corporate boardroom than you're going to find in my abuser programs.
Yeah, I will definitely say that he had a lot of the characteristic traits that he was of his behavior that people would say, oh, well, that's a narcissist. But really, guys, he's an abuser. And what he was doing was abusing me. I mean, he even would do a spiritual abuse. You know, when he would tell me that he smeared me, he's like, now love covers a multitude of sins, so you have to forgive me. And not, you know, and if let me get on my
let me get on my soapbox here. There is nothing in the criteria for a narcissistic personality disorder that talks about abuse. So plainly, not all narcissists are abusive. It's not one of the criteria. And not all abusers are narcissists. So we look at them as abusers. We look at their behaviors. We look at their belief systems. It matters not one whit to me whether someone's a narcissist or not. And it shouldn't to victims either.
Right.
That's not the problem. The problem is his behavior and not what you think he is.
Right. Yeah, I don't think he has a personality disorder. I think there is a lot of other things wrong with him that after they just kept adding up became a very dangerous combination. I thought I won't feel safe even sleeping next to him. during the day.
Witlee, he crazy,
Oh, 100%.
right? He crazy.
100%.
And so it doesn't matter. What matters is your safety and your healing. And
Yeah.
that's what I would tell any victim. Please stay away from therapists who treat narcissistic abuse, because there's no such thing. If they are treating you for narcissistic abuse, they don't have any expertise in domestic violence.
Right.
And I want to point out too that I'm a dually licensed therapist. I'm a clinical social worker and a licensed marriage and family therapist. And in not one of my my post or my graduate or postgraduate classes did I ever study domestic violence. And that's because it is not an abnormal psychological disorder or behavior or disease.
Yeah.
And so domestic violence is not rooted, the cause of it is not rooted in any mental illness or mental problem. Therefore, we didn't study it. There are therapists who had an interest in it and may have like taken a class in it that wasn't one of their required classes. But most therapists, and I do a lot of regional training of clinicians on domestic violence, especially on abusers, and I take a survey each time. About 11 to 20% is the maximum number of clinicians who've ever taken a domestic violence class. So then those who are working with either abusers or victims, unless they have taken all the necessary classes to specialize in this, they may do a great job with trauma work long after the risk is gone.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's when you go to therapy to work on the trauma. And at that point, it doesn't matter who he is or what he is, or whether he's a narcissist or not. You're working at healing on your trauma, healing your trauma at that point. But when somebody is still in an abusive relationship, or when they are just fresh out of one, what they need to do is work with advocates who understand safety needs before going to a therapist to talk about trauma, doing trauma work.
Yeah. And I will say, because narcissism has become such a popular thing, and I just kept seeing all these memes on narcissism, that when I was going through this and after I got out, I didn't think it was as bad as it was, because I kept thinking he's just a narcissist. And it wasn't until I reached out to Julie Owens, who, you know, Julie Owens, and she's an expert, that I said, Julie, what is this? And she said, that's domestic violence. That's domestic abuse. And guys, my heart just fell to my stomach. I felt so sick because I thought, oh my gosh, this was a lot more serious than I realized.
Than him just being a narcissist, right?
Right. And then I think the further I got away from the relationship, and as time was kind of passing by, I realized exactly how bad it was. And it was pretty bad. I mean, there's tons more than what I'm sharing here, but I mean, you know, you see horror films and you see, you know, these crazy, you know, exes or boyfriends or husbands, and they're doing, you know, like, you're like, oh my gosh, is that even real? And to see and like just go over everything he did is just like, oh my gosh, it was pure evil. And scary.
Very scary. And that's what you want to look at. But you're right. You fell into that trap, exactly what I was talking about, especially at the beginning of this, when I talked about there was no billboard to put up for you because he had never physically assaulted you. So you couldn't wrap your head around it. So you heard this trendy narcissistic abuse and you're like, oh, okay, that must be it. All right. But you know, if you were to go to a counselor and say, I want to work on why I'm attracted to narcissistic abusers, right?
Yeah.
then that's it, somebody who's not a domestic violence expert will go from there and work with you, because we're supposed to meet clients where they are, right?
Right.
So that's what you want to work on. But in the meantime, he's stalking you,
Oh, yeah.
right? And you're at risk.
Mhm.
Is that therapist going to know how to deal with that?
Right.
Is she going to work with you on safety or on the trauma from the abuse, right? So it's really, really important that people hear that. Please stop using the term narcissistic abuse. Please stop labeling all abusers as narcissists and all narcissists as abusers.
Right.
And please get help from professionals in the field, which means domestic violence advocates who are tied to your local shelter or victim services, because they're trained in working with victims who are still in a relationship or trying to get out or have just left a relationship.
Mhm. I will say that, he very much made me believe that what he was saying and doing was love, but it wasn't love. It was actually a nightmare. And he knew what to say. He knew what to do to mess with my head and mess with my emotions, to where it kind of felt like this constant roller coaster of emotions of, are we good? Are we not good? He would be really good at doing something unbelievably intentionally hurtful, and then being like, I'm so sorry, I apologize, and then trying to make it right, and then turning right back around and doing the same thing. And so as I'm now getting better situated into thinking, okay, we're good again. Okay, he's making amends. He would do it again. He would abuse again. And so really, I wasn't able to see things fully until I got away. And I think that's important for people to understand. When we're in it, it's not always easy for us to see everything.
No.
And so, like you're saying, why didn't you leave? We didn't know we should have left. We didn't see all the red flags. They weren't happening at once. They would be covered over by, yes.
And most of the time, they look like something else. And
right.
So it's hard to put that pattern together. That's why that support system that he isolates you from is so important, because you have to start listening to your friends. If your friends are seeing the red flags and telling you, say, B, I'm worried about you, you haven't been out with your girlfriends in 6 months, he's taken up all your time. And, I don't want to get defensive, but I'll protect him and get defensive against my friends. And I may cut off contact with my friends because I feel that they're maligning him. Right. And so he has successfully now isolated me from my friends.
And he tried to isolate me. I mean, I remember talking to them and them bringing up some concerns, and then talking to him and saying, I talked to them and this is their concerns. And he said, you know what? I don't think people should be getting involved in our relationship. That we should be keeping this just between us. I don't think you should be listening to them. Like, this is us. You're not going to be marrying them. We need to just be focusing on us. And it wasn't until a lot later, like after I got out of the relationship, that I was like, oh my gosh, she was trying to isolate me. Well, how did I know?
This guy, I'm laughing because he's so textbook, but you were like in it and you couldn't see the forest for the trees. You're in the middle of the forest, right?
Right.
So, yeah, that's very typical, but I did want to put that out there. That's one of my little soapboxes. And I
appreciate that. I just want to thank B for being on this episode. I really think that this will help to spread awareness, and I think even open people's eyes to really knowing kind of what red flags are. And, maybe you're in the same situation, or somebody that is, and you're like, oh my gosh, this sounds exactly like that situation. Yeah. And now, it is abuse. It's not something just to be kind of dismissed and, just written off. It's something that you need to really be paying attention to. I just hope until our next episode that everybody will live each day with purpose and making a difference, one day, one life at a time. Again, B, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me on.